The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on my forehead as I walked through the dusty streets of Cedar Creek. My footsteps echoed in the silent afternoon, broken only by the distant sounds of horses and the creaking of old saloon floorboards. I wasn't a man to frequent town more than necessary. My life was on the ranch tending to cattle and maintaining the property I inherited from my father. But that day, something different hung in the air. A group had gathered in the town square, voices whispering among themselves, and a strange feeling settled in my chest. I approached slowly, maintaining the distance I always kept from the people of that small town where everyone knew each other, but few truly cared. That's when I saw her. A thin girl with disheveled brown hair and eyes that seemed to have seen more pain than any 16-year-old should know. She was at the center of a circle of men, trembling slightly despite the suffocating heat. Beside her, a burly man reeking of cheap whiskey gesticulated aggressively, talking about getting rid of the burden and recovering the money spent on the girl. My stomach churned as I understood what was happening. An auction. A human auction disguised as a legitimate business transaction. The girl, Clara, I heard someone call her, kept her eyes fixed on the ground, as if she wished to disappear. Her hunched shoulders told a story of fear and resignation that hit me like a punch to the gut. Her uncle Thomas McCoy was known in the region as a violent drunkard. He had lost his wife years ago, and since then had drowned himself further in drink and bitterness. The girl had been left in his care after her parents died of fever, but from the whispers I heard, she was treated more like a servant than family. McCoy shouted numbers, spoke about her being good for housework and young enough to bear children, while some local men made offers as if they were buying cattle. My jaw tightened and my fists clenched involuntarily. I had seen much bad in that barren land, but this crossed all lines of human decency. Clara looked up for a moment and our eyes met. In those brown eyes was a silent plea, a desperation that cut through my soul. Without thinking twice, I stepped forward. $200, my voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a whip. Silence fell over the square like a heavy shroud. Everyone turned to look at me. Eli Turner, the solitary rancher who rarely spoke to anyone in town, much less got involved in dubious business. McCoy stared at me with bloodshot eyes, clearly surprised by my generous offer. $200. Are you sure, Turner? He asked, greed shining in his sweaty face. I nodded, pulling the money from the inside pocket of my vest. It wasn't a small sum. It represented months of hard work with the cattle. But looking at Clara, who now gazed at me with a mixture of fear and hope, I knew there was no choice. I couldn't leave her in the hands of those men. The transaction was quickly concluded, with a few papers signed and money changing hands. McCoy staggered off, likely straight to the nearest saloon, while the crowd slowly dispersed, whispering among themselves about the solitary rancher's strange behavior. Clara remained motionless, still processing what had happened. I approached her slowly as I would a wounded animal, aware that any sudden movement might scare her further. "My name is Eli Turner," I said softly. "You don't need to be afraid. I'll take you to my ranch where you'll be safe." She looked at me with distrust, a completely understandable reaction, given the circumstances. Her lips moved slightly, but no sound came out. She extended her hand hesitantly, and when our palms touched, I felt the tremor running through her fragile body. The ride back to the ranch was made in absolute silence. Clara rode on the back of my horse, timidly clutching my shirt as we passed over rougher terrain. The warm Texas wind blew through our hair, carrying the scent of dry earth and burned grass. I could feel the tension in her muscles, the stiffness of someone constantly prepared to flee or defend herself. When we finally arrived at the ranch, a modest property with a wooden house, a stable, and vast fenced fields, she dismounted and stood, observing everything with cautious eyes. "This will be your home now," I said, breaking the silence. "There's a room in the back you can use. Tomorrow we'll talk about how things work around here." Clara nodded slightly, still not speaking, and followed me into the house that would now be our shared refuge. The first few days on the ranch were marked by a heavy silence that hung between us like the dust rising from the dry fields. Clara moved through the house like a shadow, always keeping her distance, always alert. I saw her in the mornings, waking before the sun and silently tidying the room I offered her. as if to erase any evidence of her presence. During meals, she ate quickly, her eyes always downcast, chewing slowly like someone unaccustomed to having enough food. I tried to start conversations, asking about small daily things, but received only nods or whispered monosyllables. The distrust in her eyes was clear. She was waiting for the moment I would reveal my true intentions, when the mask of kindness would fall and she would discover the real price of her freedom. In town, however, tongues didn't stop wagging. Cedar Creek was too small to keep secrets, too large for people to truly care about each other. At Johnson's General Store, I felt the curious glances and whispers that abruptly ceased when I approached the shelves. "Turner bought that orphan girl," I heard fragments of conversations. "A solitary man like him. What does he want with a girl that age?" the church ladies speculated. At the post office, old Pete greeted me with a forced smile and indirect questions about how things were at the ranch. Even Sheriff Morrison, usually cordial, looked at me with a calculating expression when our paths crossed on Main Street. The reputation I had built over the years, that of a hard-working, honest man, began to crack under the weight of malicious speculation. Clara seemed to feel this pressure too, even without leaving the ranch. When I returned from town with supplies, she read the tension in my face and retreated further, as if she were to blame for the problems I was facing. One afternoon, while I was mending a broken fence, she approached hesitantly, carrying a glass of fresh water. "I'm sorry," she said in a voice so low I barely heard it over the wind. "I'm sorry for the trouble I'm causing." I stopped what I was doing and faced her, seeing for the first time a flicker of courage in her eyes. "You're not causing any trouble," I replied firmly. "It's the people in this town who need to learn to mind their own business." She nodded, but I realized her words carried a much greater weight than a simple apology. There was a deep guilt there, formed by years of being treated as a burden. It was on a Thursday night, as a storm approached the horizon, that everything changed drastically. I was in the stable checking to make sure the horses were secure when I heard the sound of hooves approaching rapidly. Clara was in the house, likely already asleep, and my first instinct was to protect her. I stepped out of the stable with my rifle in hand, prepared for whatever might come. It was Thomas McCoy, stumbling on a horse that seemed as drunk as its owner. His eyes were bloodshot, and even from a distance I could smell the acrid scent of whiskey emanating from him. "Turner!" he yelled, dismounting awkwardly. "You owe me more money. 200 wasn't enough for a girl like that. She's worth a lot more, and you know it." His voice was slurred, but there was a real threat behind the drunken words. I kept the rifle low, but ready. "We already paid what was agreed upon, McCoy. Now leave," I replied firmly, stepping forward to put myself between him and the house. But the man laughed unpleasantly, spitting on the dusty ground. "Agreed. I didn't agree to anything. That girl belongs to me by blood, and if you want her so badly, you'll have to pay the fair price." It was then that Clara appeared on the porch, drawn by the shouting. When McCoy saw her, his eyes gleamed with a possessive fury that chilled my blood. "Come here, girl. Your new owner doesn't want to pay what you're worth, so you're coming back with me." Clara cowered against the house wall, terror plastered on her face. In that moment, something broke inside me. It wasn't just about justice or doing what was right. It was about protecting someone who had become important to me in a way I couldn't yet fully comprehend. "She's not going anywhere with you," I said, raising the rifle. McCoy laughed again, but there was less conviction in his laugh now. "You don't have the guts to shoot, Turner. Everyone knows you're a peaceful man." He took a few stumbling steps toward the porch, and I could see Clara trembling with fear. The wind was getting stronger, bringing with it the smell of rain and electricity. Lightning cut across the dark sky in the distance, momentarily illuminating our tense faces. "Maybe you're right about me being a peaceful man," I said, feeling my voice deepen. "But when it comes to protecting those under my roof, there's nothing I wouldn't do." I cocked the rifle, and the sound echoed clearly in the night. McCoy stopped, finally realizing he had crossed a line he shouldn't have. The storm was coming, and with it, a definitive change in our lives. The standoff lasted several tense minutes, with McCoy oscillating between drunken arrogance and growing fear in the face of my rifle barrel. The first raindrops began to fall, creating small dust clouds on the dry ground. "You don't understand, Turner. he grunted, wiping saliva from the corner of his mouth. "This girl cost me years of food and shelter. I have rights over her." His words filled me with a rage I didn't know I possessed. Clara remained motionless on the porch, her eyes fixed on both of us, as if watching the judgment that would decide her fate. "The only rights you had," I responded slowly, "you sold for $200 and a bottle of whiskey." The wind howled around us, carrying dry leaves and the metallic scent of the approaching storm. McCoy spat on the ground again, his small eyes gleaming with hatred. "All right, Turner. You win this time," he finally said, backing towards his horse. But there was something in his voice, a sinister promise that kept me on alert. "But this isn't over. I'll be back with the sheriff with official papers. I'll tell everyone what you really are, a man who buys orphan girls to satisfy his dirty needs." He climbed onto the horse with difficulty, almost falling off the other side. "And when I come back, you'll find out what happens to men like you in this town." He spurred the animal brutally and rode off down the dark road, leaving only the echo of his threats and the sound of receding hooves. I remained still until the sound completely disappeared, then lowered the rifle and turned to Clara. She was pale as a ghost, her arms crossed over her chest as if trying to shield herself from the chill that began to arrive with the storm. "Will he make good on his threat?" Clara asked, finally breaking the silence that had settled between us. Her voice trembled, but there was a new determination there, as if the confrontation had awakened something within her. I walked to the porch, feeling the weight of the situation on my shoulders. "He'll probably try," I answered honestly. "But we have nothing to hide. You are here of your own free will, safe, and any decent person can see that." The rain began to fall harder, drumming on the tin roof of the house, with a rhythm that seemed to mark the tempo of a new phase in our lives. Clara looked at me for a long moment, studying my face in the dim light from the living room window. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Why did you buy me? Why are you protecting me?" It was a question I had asked myself dozens of times in the past few days, without finding a satisfactory answer. "Because it was the right thing to do," I replied, though I knew the answer was more complex than that. We went inside to escape the rain that was now pouring down, drenching the parched Texas earth. Inside the house, I lit the lantern, and we sat at the kitchen table, the sound of the storm creating a kind of forced intimacy between us. Clara nervously fidgeted with her hands, and for the first time since she arrived at the ranch, she seemed willing to speak. "My parents," she began hesitantly, "they were good people. They had a small farm near here, raised chickens and grew corn. When they died of fever, I had no one left but Uncle Thomas." Her voice grew softer, laden with pain. "At first he wasn't so bad, but the drink changed everything. I became just another mouth to feed, another problem to solve." I listened to every word carefully, beginning to understand the depth of the trauma she carried. That night, as the storm raged outside, Clara told me about the last 3 years of her life. The heavy chores she was forced to do, the nights she went to bed hungry because McCoy spent food money on drink, the moments of terror when he came home drunk and violent. "He never touched me in an inappropriate way," she said quickly, as if to reassure me. "But his hands were heavy, and his tongue even crueler. I was just an object to him, something to be used and discarded when no longer useful." As she spoke, I felt a rage growing inside me, not just against McCoy, but against a society that allowed children to be treated as property. "When I saw you give that money for me," she continued, "I thought I was just trading one owner for another. But you're different." For the first time, a small smile touched her lips. The storm finally passed a few hours before dawn, leaving the air clean and fresh. I watched from the window as the first rays of sun illuminated the rain-washed landscape, transforming the world into something new and full of possibilities. Clara had fallen asleep in the kitchen chair, exhausted by the emotional tension of the night, and I carefully covered her with a blanket before going out to check for storm damage. The fields looked greener, the plants invigorated by the much-needed water. As I walked around the ranch, I felt a change in myself too. It was no longer just a place where I lived isolated from the world, but a home I was willing to defend. When Clara woke up a few hours later, there was a new determination in her eyes. "If he comes back," she said simply, "we'll be ready." And at that moment, I realized we were no longer two strangers brought together by circumstances. We were a family, small and improbable, but real. 2 weeks had passed since the night of the storm, and McCoy had shown no signs of life. The town, however, was buzzing with the rumors he had spread before disappearing again into drink and resentment. At the general store, conversations ceased when I entered, replaced by furtive glances and malicious whispers. Mrs. Pettigrew, who had always been cordial, now greeted me coldly, her small eyes gleaming with disapproval. "It's not natural," I heard her tell a friend as I picked out supplies, "a man his age, living with a young girl. If she were my daughter, I wouldn't allow it." I swallowed my anger and continued my shopping in silence, knowing that any reaction from me would be interpreted as confirmation of their suspicions. Clara had insisted on accompanying me on that trip to town, despite my protests, and I could see how she absorbed every hostile glance, every whispered comment, like physical blows. At the ranch, however, our life had found a comfortable rhythm. Clara had proven herself a tireless worker, voluntarily taking on household chores and even helping with the cattle when I allowed it. Her hands, once trembling and hesitant, now moved with confidence as she prepared meals or tended the small garden she had started planting behind the house. "My mother taught me to cook," she said one morning, serving perfectly seasoned scrambled eggs. "She said a woman who knows how to cook never goes hungry." There was pride in her voice, a simple joy in being able to contribute significantly to our shared life. We talked more now, about the weather, about plans for the ranch, about small memories from our past lives. Slowly, the silences between us ceased to be uncomfortable and became companionable, filled with a mutual understanding that grew with each passing day. It was on a Saturday afternoon, when the sun was particularly merciless and I was working on mending the stable roof, that Sheriff Morrison appeared at the ranch. He came alone, riding his bay horse, but there was a formality in his posture that immediately put me on alert. Clara was hanging clothes on the line when he arrived, and I saw her stiffen, her hands pausing mid-motion. "Afternoon, Turner," Morrison greeted, dismounting slowly. He was a short, stocky man with a grizzled mustache and eyes that had seen much of human nature over the years. "I need to have a word with you about the girl's situation." I climbed down the ladder, wiping my hands on the cloth I carried in my pocket. "What situation, Sheriff?" I asked, though I already knew exactly what it was about. Clara approached slowly, staying slightly behind me, as if seeking protection. "I've heard some things in town," Morrison said, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning hair. "McCoy's been spreading stories about how about the nature of your arrangement with the girl here." He avoided looking directly at Clara, focusing on me with an expression that mixed professional discomfort with personal curiosity. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything, understand? But my job is to ensure everyone in my jurisdiction is safe and being treated properly." I crossed my arms, feeling the tension grow between us. "Clara is safe here, Sheriff. She has her own room, her own things, and is free to leave whenever she wants." I looked at her, and she nodded firmly. "Isn't that right, Clara?" She took a step forward, surprising both me and the sheriff with her sudden determination. "It's true, Mr. Morrison. Mr. Turner saved me from a terrible situation. He has never hurt me or treated me with disrespect." The sheriff studied Clara's face carefully, looking for signs of coercion or fear, but what he saw must have been convincing because his posture relaxed slightly. "I understand," he said slowly. "But you need to understand, Turner, that appearances matter in a small town like ours. People talk, they make assumptions, and those assumptions can cause problems for both you and the girl." He replaced his hat, preparing to leave. "Perhaps it would be best if you formalized the situation in some way, a legal adoption perhaps, or found an appropriate family for her." Clara stiffened at those words, her eyes gleaming with something that looked like panic. "I don't want to go anywhere else," she said quickly. "This is my home now." Morrison sighed, clearly torn between his official duty and what his eyes were seeing, a happy and safe girl living with a man who obviously cared for her well-being. After the sheriff left, Clara and I stood in silence for a long time, watching the dust raised by his horse's hooves settle on the road. The weight of his words hung between us like a heavy cloud. "Do you think we should formalize our situation?" I asked finally, not wanting to pressure but knowing we needed to discuss the matter. Clara looked at me with those brown eyes that had become so familiar, so dear. "I would like that," she said softly. "I would like to be officially your adopted daughter." The word hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning and hope. I felt something shift within my chest, an emotion I hadn't experienced in years, the feeling of belonging to a family again. "Then that's what we'll do," I replied, my voice slightly hoarse. "We'll make official what is already real." In that moment, under the endless Texas sky, we were more than two people thrown together by circumstances. We were father and daughter, united not by blood, but by something even stronger, choice and love.